School, and today's presentation we're going to talk about why that canal is where it is and the historical background of a specific place along the canal, because there's a spot on the west side of Rome, New York, with a history that goes back to the Indians, well, the Native Americans, who called it the Great Carrying Place. The British called it the Oneida Carry, and it is where construction started on the canal in 1817, and we're going to go through a lot of this history today. But we start out looking at OpenStreetMap and the eastern seaboard. And so the geography here, which I think everybody knows, but everybody does not think about, that you have coastal access all along around. And so the British basically by colonial times had control from Georgia into Maine and then Canada, which they had taken away from the French. The Spanish had control over Florida, which they could reach easily by sea. The French had control over Louisiana with easy sea access and the Mississippi River going north until they lost everything in the final French-Indian War. But the main geographical property here, the French had access up the Mississippi. They had control over the St. Lawrence Seaway up until the British finally pushed them out of North America. The British had control of much of the eastern seaboard, but there's this mountain range. And the mountain range starts in northern Alabama and northern Georgia, called the Appalachians, and it runs up the coast through New York, Vermont, a little bit of it in western Massachusetts, called the Berkshires, on through New Hampshire and into Maine. And so you have this one major gouge through the mountains, which is the St. Lawrence to the Great Lakes. But really, the mountains are a pretty formidable barrier, and we tend to make fun of the Appalachians today because they're old and worn down, and they don't compare at all to the Rockies or the Alps. But think about the 16 and 1700s, when there were no trains, no railroads, no cars. Your transportation basically consisted of boats and ships and horses and wagons, horses and carriages. And so the Appalachians are a much more formidable barrier when that's your transportation mode. So we're going to zoom in a little and we're going to look at some of the gaps, and we see the Chesapeake, we see the Delaware, which leads to the Delaware Water Gap, we see the Hudson, and the Chesapeake and the Delaware Water Gap have their limitations. And the situation during the period when the French and the British were vying for control over North America was the French had much easier access towards the area here between the Mississippi and the Appalachians, which today we call the Old Northwest. At the time it was simply the Northwest. It was an area the British and the French both aspired to control. The period of interest is from the 1600s through the 1700s. It's frequently called the 100 Years' War. There was basically an extended Cold War between the British and the French, which on 4 occasions broke out into hot war. Basically, there were hot wars in Europe, which corresponded to hot wars in North America. The first 3 of these wars are often called the Wars of Secession. For example, the War of Austrian Secession. and they started before the war spilled over into North America. The final war is often taught in U.S. Schools as the French and Indian War, but it was merely the last of the 4 French and Indian Wars. And it differs from the first 3 in that it was actually triggered by George Washington, who was leading a small colonial force which ambushed a French patrol. And after 2 years of the French and Indian War, the final one, it spilled over into Europe. And that's just basically the way it was in the 1600s. You had the British and the French facing off here in the Hudson Valley and Lake Champlain, facing off in the Old Northwest. The trigger for the final French and Indian War had to do with the French siting of Fort Duquesne, which was located at modern Pittsburgh, where the rivers came together. And so this was a real concern to the British when it was a British colony along the coast, is access to the disputed territories. The French just had it way easier. The major advantage of the British in this period was that there were substantially more British colonists than there were French. By the time of the final French-Indian War, it was 2 orders of magnitude. The French were much more heavily dependent on alliances with the natives than the British were. And the British were sending regulars, and the French were, not really doing so much of that. And it's why the British ultimately won the final of these wars and drove the French out of North America. But there was always this problem of getting access across the Appalachians, and George Washington is a factor in this. He, while under British rule, had acquired substantial amounts of property on the western side of West Virginia under British patents. Of course, the French didn't agree that it was Washington's property, but Washington thought it was his property, and Washington was very interested in gaining access, and he actually funded a canal company called the Potomac Canal Company, whose goal was to use the Potomac River, which runs from the Chesapeake Bay up past Washington and into the mountains. As he was a Virginian and had a Virginian mindset, although he ultimately became president of the whole country because he could see a bigger picture, but he was still pretty focused on Virginia. The Potomac Company built something, but it was not a financial success. Its assets after it failed, which was after Washington's death, the assets were acquired by the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal Company, which did build a canal, but its importance was relatively weak, and it was finished pretty late in the day, and the Baltimore and Ohio Railway rendered it obsolete. Chesapeake and Ohio is still there today. I mean, it's worth probably someone doing a OHM project to map that period, but it's not my project, and it's probably not going to be because I have way too many booked. But it's just something to think about. The Chesapeake and Ohio Canal does not tend to get taught about. The canal that gets taught about is the Erie Canal. And it is such a significant piece of history that me, growing up in Florida, going to Florida public schools, learned the Erie Canal song in elementary school, just like many of you probably did. But we didn't necessarily get a lot of context. And there are a lot of things we don't know. But we're going to zoom in on a specific area. Before the British and the French fought it out over North America, there was a previous conflict in which the British and the Dutch fought it out over North America. Because in the early mid-1600s, the Dutch were a first-class world power, and they were able, in that version of their Dutch Empire, to fight it out toe-to-toe with the British, which may seem odd today, but, small European nations with powerful fleets, they were fighting it out. And then the Dutch had control over the seacoast from the Delaware Bay north into Connecticut to the Connecticut River, so that included New York and Long Island. And they claimed it because they hired an Englishman, Henry Hudson, to explore with the idea of finding the Northwest Passage, which everybody was sure existed, that allowed access to the Pacific. And it turns out there is a Northwest Passage, and it's pretty far north, and it has tended to be frozen over most of the year, or for most of the time that we've known about it. That's why it was so hard to find and why it's so hard to use, although with rising temperatures that seems to be changing. So Hudson did find a river, which was subsequently named the Hudson River. He sailed north on it, and he got as far as modern Albany. And he claimed it for the Dutch. He was in their employ, even though he was an Englishman. He claimed it for his employer. And the Dutch were, like the French, primarily interested in the fur trade. This was a distinct difference between the British approach to the colonies and the French approach and the Dutch approach. The British settled. They brought a lot of people over to be British subjects along the coast in the colonies, whereas the British and the Dutch were primarily focused on beaver pelts because they were tremendously valuable, and they were something you could trade with the Indians for, and that was how they approached it. So the Dutch built a city on the tip of Manhattan Island, where the Mouse is now, named New Amsterdam, which was a trade center, and they built a city, settlement in what is modern Albany, which was composed of two parts: Fort Orange, which was a military garrison of sorts, and Beverwyck, which was a civilian community. Then, without going into a painful amount of detail, basically they were under different competing Dutch administrations, and they did not get along, and there was a lot of tension. It was not well organized or well thought out. But, that's just the nature of the Dutch occupation. So when the British decided to take it away from the Dutch, it was actually comparatively easy. And the Dutch colonists happily continued their business under British rule, and it traded hands once, back to the Dutch and then back to the British, and that was the end of it. The British named the settlement Albany after the Duke of Albany, if I remember correctly. They renamed New Amsterdam, New York, and started settling. They also pretty much permitted the Dutch settlers to go about their business. The Van Rensselaer family had patents over much of the land. The British did not disturb that, and so the Van Rensselaer family became prominent local citizens under British rule as they had been under Dutch rule. They were flexible in their allegiances, and ultimately when the American Revolution started, there were Dutch who were prominent in the Revolutionary War movement, supporting the Continental cause. They became attached to their land and were fighting for their land to be under their control and under their self-government. They were completely on board with the logic. So, in colonial times, you'll go back into the records and you'll actually see discussion about navigation along the Mohawk River. Now, the Mohawk River runs, this line is showing us the Mohawk River and The New York State Thruway, the modern highway, Interstate 90, runs parallel to the Mohawk up to the Utica area. There's a lot of interest in improving navigation on the Mohawk. There's a specific reason for it. We're going to zoom in here. And at some point, we're going to get to the right zoom level on the right location. Here we have the river running along through here, the various communities along it. Here it is, Little Falls. Now, Little Falls is a interesting location here. Note that the Mohawk River continues through it. And the best way to understand why Little Falls is significant is to look here at TopoView, a USGS site for topographic maps. Let's bring Little Falls to the middle of this and zoom in until we get some contour lines. Got to do one more zoom level to get good contour lines for Little Falls. Now, for anyone who doesn't know how to read contour maps, hopefully that's none of you, but you never know. If you look at how close the contour lines are on either side of Little Falls, you realize that this is cutting a gorge through a pretty significant elevation. And in fact, the Mohawk River is pretty much the only river between Maine and northern Georgia that actually cuts through. The Potomac does not, the Delaware does not, none of them do. And this is why there was so much interest in the Mohawk, because while it was in fact rising, there were waterfalls along its length. The simple fact of the matter was that as long as you were willing to do the occasional portage when there was a fall, you could get a boat up the Mohawk. And concept here that once again I'm thinking that probably most of you understand enough geography to know this already, but I'll repeat it here, is the idea of a divide. In the Rockies are the location of the Continental Divide, where all the water on one side flows west of the Pacific and all the water on the east side flows downstream in the general direction of the Mississippi River. Well, there are divides everywhere. And so, for example, if you were to actually research this, you would find that this area here, the Hudson River goes past Glens Falls. Up here you see Lake George, and you see Lake Champlain, and that looks kind of like that's a easy water route. Well, the divide is here between Glens Falls and Lake George. And water from Lake George flows north, and water from Glens Falls and the headwaters of the Hudson flows south. And then you get here to the end of Lake George, and Deschutes River empties into Lake Champlain, and it's like, well, maybe that's navigable. Well, the Lake George is a couple hundred feet higher than Lake Champlain, and even though this distance on the ground is short, you cannot navigate the Deschutes River, and actually there is a road in Ticonderoga which is literally named the Portage. And that road is, as far as I can tell, the actual location of the portage that was used in order to move boats and cargo from the Champlain up to Lake George. And maybe someday some of you will go on my guided tour of the Saratoga campaign of 1777, and we'll take a look at the Deschutes River and the tremendous elevation changes there. But let's go back to Little Falls. Is that then the Mohawk continues to be in this quasi-navigable state as it continues onward. It goes through modern Utica, which was once actually a significant city, and now it's tends to joke about it because a very bad beer Utica Club was made there for a very long time. But generational change at the brewery that made Utica Club happened, and now they actually custom bottle an awful lot of pretty decent craft beer. And so we stopped telling Utica Club jokes a while ago, unless you're of a certain generation. Mohawk continues up to Rome. And what's important about Rome is that this is the divide between eastern and western New York. We're looking at the headwaters of the Mohawk, and it meanders off into, no particular direction. And then a couple miles away from the headwaters of the Mohawk, there's a little tiny, or there was a little tiny creek named Wood Creek. And Wood Creek flowed in the opposite direction and eventually emptied into Oneida Lake. Oneida Lake is named after the Oneida Indians, which are a tribe in the Iroquois Federation, the Oneida Nation, and they were settled around the lake. Being part of the Iroquois Nation, they were a British ally, which actually matters to this story. So this was all well understood, and in colonial times, this route was a route that the British used in order to access upstate New York from Albany. And I'm not going to look too much at the modern map anymore, but I do want to show you this postcard of Little Falls from, I think, 1903, which I think shows you what that gorge looked like, what it actually managed to cut through. It was not trivial, but it did make the Mohawk very attractive that this existed. So Wood Creek was pretty important, really important. Even though it was a tiny little creek that you could put a small boat on and it twisted and turned, but the point was that if you could get a small boat to Wood Creek from Rome, well, before Rome it was called Fort Stanwix, then you could get to Oneida Lake with the occasional portage. And so one of the challenges, since this is also about mapping resources, is that historic Wood Creek is really hard to figure out from modern mapping sources. But it's not impossible. So let's go look at Rome. If we look at modern Rome, well, we see a bunch of things. One of the things that's really obvious is this straight gash through the landscape. This is actually the modern Erie Canal, aka the New York State Barge Canal. It was built in the early 1900s to replace its precursors as the Erie Canal. And if we come up here, you see, look at that. There's waterway here labeled the enlarged Erie Canal, and you see that there are larger polygons here. This was the actual path of what's called the enlarged Erie Canal. And then we see it kind of disappears here, and then there's something named Erie Boulevard. And Erie Boulevard was once the path of the enlarged canal. and then they filled it in and turned it into a highway. And up here there's something named Wood Creek, and this is actually, it's been disturbed a bit by urbanization, but it does flow here until it meets the remnants of the enlarged Erie Canal. In historical times, it continued on into this largely empty area here south of Rome. This area, pretty soggy, so I don't think there's a lot of development pressure in Rome that would cause people to want to try and do anything here. And then we see something labeled Mud Creek. And Mud Creek is more or less in the place where a lot of Wood Creek once was. And we zoom in here, and we see Wood Creek, a connector to enlarged Erie Canal, and then Wood Creek is following along, meandering on its old path. And of course, one of the things that, if you understand geology of rivers, is that when you see a meandering river, that means that the area is pretty flat. So yeah, Wood Creek wasn't really going over a lot of waterfalls through here, so if you were willing to put up with the meandering, you could get a small boat down it with, paddling without a lot of stress. So going back to this website, Corey Wilson, who has a really good YouTube channel on his work, documenting the historic canal, turned me onto this website. He also has a historic Erie Canal group on Facebook that's been, really helpful to me. Good guy. Go look at his YouTube channel. But he pointed me at this website. This website was produced by archaeologists whose goal was to identify historic Wood Creek, do the archaeological research, find the landmarks, and document things. And a lot of this predates the construction of the Erie Canal, and so these are potentially really valuable resources. So, for example, here's a map showing Lynch's Pond. This shows where Lynch's Pond was, which is now part of urban Rome and has disappeared. And as we scroll down, we can see places where the portage occurred, Wood Creek. Identifying things from topography. I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail, but it's all pretty significant. And let's go back to the map. Let's get ourselves a little closer in on Rome. It's very important to the British to defend this point. So this area that's labeled a park on the topo maps is the Fort Stanwix National Monument. There is a replica of Fort Stanwix there. It was a wooden fort. It was built in classic European star fort format, but it was a wooden fort, and so there are no surviving pieces of the original fort. So yeah, you pretty much, if you want to see the fort, you've got to see a replica, because there's nothing left other than the site. This was at the head of the Mohawk. This was designed to protect one end of this portage from the Mohawk to Wood Creek. And then on the other end here, and this is a specific important location that we're going to be talking about right here, this was the location of Fort Bull, which was a wooden fort built in the 1750s to protect the Wood Creek end of the portage. Fort Bull only lasted a couple of years. It was destroyed by the French when they attacked. The British would rebuild it under the name Fort Wood Creek. a year later, and then burned it themselves within a couple of months because they decided it was indefensible against a French offensive. This was part of the final French and Indian War. So the remnants of Fort Bull are, I think the best way to put it is that they believe they know where the site is, and I'll talk about the siting of it in a minute. But I think the thing that's clear here is that this portage was pretty important to the British. It had been important to the Indians before the British. The Indians called it the Great Carrying Place, and I keep saying Indians. I really should say natives. World has changed, and I need to change too. Just brought up in a different language. The British would name it the Oneida Carry. And so that's basically carry, meaning it was a portage. And long before the Erie Canal was built, there were people trying to do something with navigation through here. And the state of New York chartered the Western Inland Lock Navigation Company. Philip Schuyler, who had been a general in the Continental Army in the Revolutionary War, was presided over it. He was a prominent citizen in Albany and Saratoga area. This was basically an effort to link the Mohawk to Wood Creek, and they built an early canal through the area called the Rome Canal. I haven't really tried to map the Rome Canal yet. And the Erie Canal was built. A little confusion in this site. Let me go here because I can. This is my own map, which overlays work I've done in Open Historic Map on OpenStreetMap. And so this is modern Rome. So looking at this, zoomed in a step too far. The green is the original Erie Canal. The blue is the enlarged canal, because when they enlarged it, they used some of the routing of the original canal, but also did rerouting. And then this darker blue line, which is sitting on this, is the modern canal. And they, a subtle point, when they built the modern canal, they discarded the Erie Canal name and the Champlain Canal name and just called it the New York State Barge Canal. And then in 1992, they decided to start using the Erie Canal name again. Open historical map life cycle problem. It's a reason why when I do this drop down with a list of canals, I've got the Erie Canal starting in 1992, and the New York State Barge Canal is ending in 1992 because the name changed, and that's part of what we do with life cycle and open historical map. So they're exactly the same canal, but the name is different. So here we see the enlarged canal on Erie Boulevard. We see how they merge here. I haven't tried to map the Rome Canal yet, although there are resources available, and I will do that, but it kind of veered a little bit north through Rome. The actual sequencing is that the Erie Canal was built well to the south of the Rome Canal and avoided downtown Rome, such as it was. The citizens of Rome turned out were unhappy about the canal going outside of downtown, so when the enlargement effort started, they got it rerouted through town. And then subsequently, when they built the barge canal was deliberately routed outside of Rome, outside of Syracuse, and outside of Rochester, even though it had been a prominent feature in town up until that point. So we're going to come in and look at this spot here, which is pretty interesting. Today, this area is known as Erie Canal Village. It basically is kind of a tourist site. I mentioned Corey Wilson earlier. He is a canal historian who has been associated with Erie Canal Village for a couple of years now. And he's been doing an actual restoration. The green, as I said earlier, this is the original canal. They took that bend out of the canal when they did the enlargement, which was started about 15 years after the original canal was built. The best way to show you what's going on here is to bring up JOSM, which I already did in advance. And this is Maxar Premium Imagery. So this is the same canal area that we've been looking at. And this is where Corey has been working. I'm going to turn off the data later because it'll be clearer. This is surviving enlarged canal up here. And this down here is the old original canal that Corey has been slowly working on restoring. And he's got videos of him working on this on his YouTube channel. Now we're going to zoom back out a step. Turn the data layer back on. This is something I entered in Open Historic Map. This is the supposed footprint of Fort Wood Creek, the second fort built here in a 2-year span in the 1750s. And why do I believe that that's the footprint? Well, now we're getting into mapping resources that are available to us. This is from the 1834 survey map series of the original canal, which is available in a couple places, including the New York State Archives, which is where I've been fetching them. And I think it may also be on Wikimedia Commons, although I'm not sure. But this shows the original canal, and it shows a location for Fort Bull. I have done a somewhat crude alignment of this in Map Warper. One of the challenges with this old map series is that its modern reference points are very, very scarce. 1834 was very different from today, and so alignment of these things can be really tricky, although there are paths that are available. So with that rough alignment, I've gone ahead and put a footprint for Fort Wood Creek. I've also got a point of interest here for Fort Bull. And the placement is based on the fact that the folks at Erie Canal Village have been permitting some archaeological work. Fort Bull is located on their property. The area down here for Fort Wood Creek is actually located on property that belongs to the Rome Historical Society. But the archaeologists have been working in the area trying to understand the true locations of these things, and right at the moment they believe Fort Bull was inside this loop road in Erie Canal Village. And that's the best placement I can do right now. And there was some confusion in the Wikipedia article on this. The article is under the name Fort Bull. Oops. Yeah, do I really... Do we need to zoom far enough out to get back there? I don't even know what we're looking at right now. Now we can zoom out a lot more. Then zoom back in. Because I really like the Apple mouse, the Apple touchpad, but it can be hypersensitive, which is how you end up in the place I am right now. So here we are, back to it. Fort Wood Creek, Fort Bull. The Wikipedia article until about 2 days ago claimed that Fort Bull and Fort Wood Creek were built on the same site. I think that was believed for a long time, but they're increasingly, the archaeologists are recognizing that wasn't actually how it happened. I've updated the Wikipedia article, but I know how they feel about sources in Wikipedia, so I'm going to be providing some references in the article before they tell me I'm wrong and fix it, because, you know, at some point an editor will do that, and I understand. So this is what happened on the west end of the Great Carrying Place. And so I've showed you the original survey maps. I've showed you the Wood Creek website. Let's go back to the Wood Creek website here. One of the things that's important is that before they actually built the Rome Canal, there was more stuff that happened here. And there were various locks and structures that were built over time. In particular, there was a lot of stuff that happened in the wetlands south and west of Rome. This area where Wood Creek was meandering was an area where they actually built a lot of early locks in the beginning of the 1800s. That these would eventually be superseded by the Erie Canal. But there is documentation. Archaeologists have been at work here. They have geolocated where stuff was. And there are resources available. And I mean, I could suppose it in theory just basically work off of these maps, but actually I'm going to be reaching out to the archaeologists in order to see if they have documentation that isn't cut down to web snippet size that I can make use of, and if they're willing to let me use that. And this is their discussion of Fort Bull here. But, you know, you see they're pointing at Fort Wood Creek and saying it's Fort Bull. And that's not what is currently thought, so this webpage seems to be a little bit out of date. Again, it's that confusion over the idea that Fort Wood Creek was built on top of Fort Wood. Excuse me, on top of Fort Bull, and the archaeologists no longer think that was true. But in any case, there's an awful lot of valuable mapping that can be done. And we're going to go to what I think is going to be the last map we look at here. This is part of the Schillner map series. The Schillner maps were a set of survey maps that were released in 1896. The survey was supervised by Schillner, which is why they're called this. And this is the same area, Wood Creek, modern Erie Canal Village. The map shows the enlarged canal, and it also shows the course of the original Erie Canal. And so one of the theories I work to here is that with these maps, if I can align the 1896 map because there are better reference points, then I can use that as a tool for possibly aligning the 1834 maps. Yes, it will introduce error, but error is something we just have to learn to deal with.